That evening, Ethan Whitmore leaned close to his wife's ear and whispered just low enough that no one else in the ballroom could hear him. He told her, in a voice dressed up as concern, that she was embarrassing him. He said the simple dress she wore did not belong among people of this class, that it looked cheap next to the diamonds and tailored silk surrounding them. He told her to stand quietly behind him, smile when it was expected, and avoid speaking to anyone who actually mattered in the room. Imani Brooks said nothing back. She only nodded, the way she always did when the truth was too large to hand to someone who had never once asked to understand her. 15 minutes later, the entire ballroom rose to its feet as the MC stepped onto the stage holding a gold envelope. She announced that the person who had secretly funded hospitals, scholarships, and dozens of community projects for 12 straight years had finally agreed to let her identity be known. A hush fell over 300 of the wealthiest people in the city. Then the MC opened the envelope and read the name aloud. It was Imani Brooks, and the first person in that room to drop his glass of champagne, the crystal shattering against the marble floor, was her own husband. Nobody who knew the Whitmores in passing would have guessed that their marriage was built on such an uneven foundation. Ethan was a corporate attorney, 44 years old, the kind of man who measured his own worth by the reflection he saw in other people's eyes. He cared, deeply and constantly, about how a room perceived him the moment he walked into it. He wanted people to notice the cut of his suit, the confidence in his handshake, and eventually, the woman standing beside him. He wanted his wife to look like a trophy, earned rather than a partner chosen, and for years he had quietly, persistently tried to shape Imani into exactly that. Imani, for her part, had never cared much for appearances. She was 42, calm in a way that unsettled people who mistook stillness for weakness, and she moved through the world with the kind of quiet discipline that comes from having survived things nobody else in the room could imagine. She wore modest clothing, not because she couldn't afford better, but because she had learned, long before she met Ethan, that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was the enemy of the work she actually cared about. She ran a family investment fund that few people outside a small circle of bankers and attorneys even knew existed, and she had spent over a decade quietly funneling profits into causes she never spoke about at dinner parties. Even Ethan, who had shared a bed with her for 9 years, believed his wife was little more than an ordinary financial consultant, someone who balanced spreadsheets for a modest client list and made a comfortable but unremarkable living. He had no idea that she held equity positions in several major corporations. He had no idea that behind the plain email signature and the unassuming business cards was a woman whose signature alone could move markets. He had built an entire version of his wife in his head, a smaller, quieter version that fit conveniently into the story he told about himself, and he had never once thought to ask her whether that version was true. Their marriage had started, years earlier, on far gentler footing than the world had eventually settled into. Ethan had been a junior associate then, ambitious but still unpolished, and Imani had liked something in the roughness of him, a hunger that felt at the time more like drive than vanity. She had watched him work impossible hours to make partner, had celebrated quietly with him the night the promotion finally came through, and had told herself that the version of him chasing status was simply a phase tied to circumstance, something that would soften once he no longer had anything left to prove. It never did. If anything, each new success only sharpened his need for the next one, and somewhere along the way, Imani had become another line item in the image he was building, evidence to be curated rather than a person to be known. She had tried, in the early years, to explain pieces of her financial life to him, mentioning an investment here, a modest fund there. But she had learned quickly that Ethan listened to these conversations the way he listened to background noise, nodding along without absorbing much of anything. He was rarely unkind about it. He simply wasn't curious, and after enough attempts met with the same distracted half-attention, Imani had stopped trying to be fully seen and had instead retreated into a version of herself that required less explaining. It was easier, she told herself, to let him believe what he already believed. It was safer, too, in ways she rarely admitted, even to herself, to keep her true resources hidden from a man who measured worth primarily in terms of what could be displayed. The weeks before the Whitmore Charity Gala were, in hindsight, the moment everything began to shift, though at the time, it looked like nothing more than another ordinary argument in a marriage full of them. Ethan had been invited to the event through his law firm, one of several corporate sponsors, and the moment the invitation arrived, something in him lit up. This was not just a gala. This was a room full of the people he had spent his entire career trying to impress, CEOs and philanthropists, and old money families whose approval he had chased since law school. He started planning weeks in advance. He picked out his own tuxedo first, a deep charcoal that his tailor swore made him look 10 years younger, and only after that did he turn his attention to what Imani would wear. When she showed him the navy dress hanging in the closet, simple and elegant in its own understated way, his face fell almost immediately. He told her it looked like something she'd wear to a work luncheon, not a gala where senators and hospital board chairs would be watching. He suggested, more than once, that she borrow something from a stylist he knew, something with a designer label people would recognize on sight. Imani listened to all of it without much reaction, the way she had learned to listen to Ethan over the years, filtering his anxiety from anything that actually mattered. She reminded him, gently, that the dress had cost more than most people's monthly salary, even if it didn't announce itself with a logo. She reminded him that she had never once embarrassed him at any event they'd attended together. But Ethan wasn't really listening for facts. He was listening for reassurance that the room would see him the way he needed to be seen. And nothing she said seemed to calm that particular fear. 2 nights before the gala, the tension boiled over into something sharper. Ethan came home late from the office, tie loosened, exhaustion mixing with irritation, and found Imani reviewing documents at the kitchen table, papers spread out in neat stacks that she quickly turned face down when he walked in. He didn't ask what she was working on. He never really did. Instead, he brought up the gala again, told her that maybe it would be simpler if she just stayed home this time, that he could tell people she wasn't feeling well. For a moment, something flickered across Imani's face, something that might have been hurt, or might have been the beginning of a decision. But she didn't argue. She told him she would go, because she wanted to see the work the foundation had done that year, though she left out the part where she meant her own foundation, the one Ethan didn't know existed. He agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that she follow a short list of rules. Don't give a speech if anyone asks. Don't strike up conversations with people you don't know. And above all, don't do anything that might embarrass him in front of people whose opinions actually counted. Imani agreed to all of it with a calm that should have worried him more than it did. She had learned, over 9 years of marriage, that some battles were not worth fighting in the moment, that some truths revealed themselves far more powerfully in silence than in argument. She packed her own small clutch, chose her own modest jewelry, and said nothing further about the matter. Ethan, satisfied that the situation was handled, went to bed, thinking he had successfully managed his wife for one more evening. He had no idea how wrong that assumption would prove to be. What Ethan didn't know, and what he would not learn until the gold envelope was opened in front of 300 witnesses, was that Samuel Pierce had called Imani earlier that same week with a request she had spent 12 years avoiding. He told her the foundation's board had voted almost unanimously to honor its most consistent benefactor publicly at this year's event, and he asked, gently but firmly, whether she might finally allow it. Imani had resisted at first, the way she always did, citing the same reasons she had given every year before. But something in her had shifted recently, a growing sense that hiding indefinitely was starting to serve her fear more than it served her purpose. After a long silence on the phone, she had finally told Samuel, yes, on one condition, that he tell absolutely no one outside the board until the moment the envelope was opened, not even her husband. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of manufactured elegance that only very wealthy institutions can produce. The ballroom of the Ashford Hotel had been transformed into something out of a film, gold light pooling across marble floors, orchids arranged in towering displays, string musicians playing softly near the entrance as guests filed in beneath crystal chandeliers. Ethan walked in first, chest puffed slightly, greeting men whose names he'd only read in business journals with a firmness in his handshake that betrayed just how much this moment meant to him. Imani followed a step behind, exactly as instructed, her navy dress moving quietly against the marble as she scanned the room with an expression that gave away nothing. To anyone watching, she looked like precisely what Ethan had trained her to appear as, a supportive spouse content to remain in the background. But her eyes moved differently than a passive observer's eyes would. She was reading the room the way someone reads a familiar document, noting names, noting faces, noting people she had funded for years but never met in person. The guest list read, like a roster of the city's most powerful institutions. Chief executives from 3 different Fortune 500 companies stood near the bar, discussing quarterly earnings. A state senator laughed loudly with a group of hospital board members near the dessert table. Journalists from 2 major papers moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who knew exactly which conversations were worth overhearing. Ethan seemed to know, or claimed to know, nearly everyone, introducing himself with a confidence that bordered on performance, mentioning his firm's name twice in every conversation, as if repetition alone could cement his importance. Across the room, 2 figures kept glancing toward Imani in a way that suggested recognition rather than mere curiosity. Samuel Pierce, the foundation's executive director, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair, and the measured warmth of someone who had spent decades asking wealthy people for money, looked her way more than once, as though fighting the urge to approach. Beside him, Victoria Langley, the Gala's chairwoman, and one of the city's most formidable philanthropic organizers, did the same, her sharp eyes softening every time they landed on Imani across the crowded floor. Each time either of them started to move toward her, Imani offered the smallest shake of her head, barely perceptible, and each time they understood immediately and turned away. It was a language built over years of careful, deliberate secrecy, a signal that tonight, of all nights, was not yet the moment. Nobody else in the ballroom noticed the exchange. Nobody except a young event photographer who caught the gesture on camera without realizing its significance, a photograph that would later circulate as evidence of just how long the truth had been hiding in plain sight. As the evening wore on, Ethan grew increasingly comfortable in his role as the center of attention, and increasingly careless about how he treated the woman standing beside him. When Imani paused to speak warmly with one of the catering staff, a young server who had mentioned, in passing, that she was saving for nursing school, Ethan pulled her aside with a tight, irritated smile still plastered on for the benefit of anyone watching. He told her she needed to learn how to choose who was worth her time in a room like this, that the wait staff wasn't why they'd come. Imani said nothing, though something in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His friend Andrew Sloan, a fellow attorney who had known Ethan since law school, laughed along with the comment, adding his own remark about how some people simply didn't understand social hierarchy. The 2 men exchanged a look that suggested they found the entire exchange amusing, a private joke at Imani's expense, delivered in a room full of people neither of them actually knew. A few minutes later, a woman in a beaded emerald gown, one of Andrew's colleagues, approached Imani with the kind of polished curiosity reserved for people trying to place a stranger within the social order. She asked, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, what exactly Imani did for a living. Imani answered simply. She said she was an investor. The woman laughed, a light, dismissive sound, and glanced toward Ethan as though sharing an inside joke about a wife who clearly didn't understand how conversations like this were supposed to work. The woman pressed further, asking which firm Imani worked for, her tone assuming the answer would reveal a junior analyst position at best. Imani told her plainly that she managed her own portfolio, along with several smaller funds tied to family holdings. The woman's smile widened into something almost pitying, and she remarked, loud enough for a few nearby guests to overhear, that it was sweet how some people described a modest hobby in such grand terms. Ethan, rather than correcting the record or defending his own wife, simply looked down at his drink and let the moment pass, unwilling to risk his own standing by drawing more attention to a conversation he clearly found uncomfortable. Imani noticed the silence more than she noticed the insult itself. It was not the first time he had chosen his own comfort over her, and some quiet part of her filed the moment away, alongside dozens of others exactly like it. Ethan laughed too, a beat too quickly, adding that his wife had always had a colorful imagination when it came to her own importance. The remark landed harder than he probably intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as he intended, and a ripple of quiet amusement moved through the small circle around them. Nobody in that circle knew that the answer Imani had given was not an exaggeration or a joke at all. It was, in fact, entirely and precisely true, and within the hour, every person standing there would understand exactly how true it was. Backstage, away from the noise of the crowd, Samuel Pierce checked his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes, his nerves showing in the way he kept adjusting his cufflinks. Victoria stood beside him, reviewing note cards with the focused calm of someone who had orchestrated dozens of galas but had never once handled an announcement quite like this one. Word had already spread among a small circle of VIP guests, board members, and major donors, who had been quietly informed earlier in the evening that tonight, after 12 years of anonymity, the Foundation's largest and most mysterious benefactor had finally agreed to be revealed. The news traveled through the ballroom in careful whispers, guest to guest, each person adding their own theory about who this benefactor might be. Some guessed it had to be someone from an old industrial family, the kind of dynasty whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings without anyone questioning where the money originated. Others guessed a reclusive tech founder, someone who had made billions, and quietly decided to give much of it away, rather than build a personal brand around generosity. Ethan, catching fragments of the speculation as he moved through the room, found himself swept up in the excitement, offering his own confident guesses to anyone who would listen. He suggested it might be one of the Ashworth family heirs, or perhaps someone connected to the pharmaceutical fortune 2 tables over. Not once, in all his speculation, did the possibility cross his mind that the answer might be standing 2 feet away from him in a navy dress he had criticized less than an hour earlier. He was so certain of his own understanding of the world, so confident that significance always announced itself loudly, that the quiet woman beside him remained entirely invisible to his imagination, even as the truth prepared to walk onto the stage in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a hush spread across the crowd as Rebecca Collins, the evening's MC, stepped up to the podium in a shimmering silver gown. She thanked the guests for their generosity, ran through the usual pleasantries about the Foundation's mission, and then gestured toward a large screen that descended slowly behind her. A video began to play, opening with images of a children's hospital wing that had opened 6 years earlier, its cheerful murals and modern equipment funded almost entirely by a single anonymous gift. The footage continued through a montage of projects that seemed, individually, unremarkable, but together painted a staggering picture. There was a scholarship program that had sent over 400 first-generation college students through 4 years of tuition. There was a research center studying pediatric cancer treatments, its opening ceremony attended by families who credited the facility with saving their children's lives. There was a disaster relief fund that had rebuilt entire neighborhoods after flooding devastated a coastal community 3 years prior, and a senior care facility that had opened its doors to elderly residents who otherwise would have had nowhere to go. The final segment of the video displayed a running total, the number climbing steadily across the screen as string music swelled behind it. 100 million, 140 million. By the time the counter stopped, the number read $180 million, a figure that drew audible gasps from across the ballroom. Rebecca Collins let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking again, her voice carrying easily through the stillness. She explained that every single dollar on that screen had come from one source, a single individual who had insisted, for 12 consecutive years, on remaining completely anonymous. No press releases, no naming rights, no photographs at ribbon cuttings. She explained that the Foundation had honored that wish faithfully, year after year, even as speculation about the benefactor's identity grew more elaborate with each passing gala. Tonight, she said, for reasons that would soon become clear, that anonymity was finally coming to an end. Ethan straightened his jacket, leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious now despite himself, along with every other guest in the room. Rebecca held up a gold envelope, the kind reserved for the evening's most significant announcements, and slid her finger beneath the seal with theatrical precision. She read the words on the card silently first, her expression softening into something like reverence before lifting her eyes back to the crowd. She said that 12 years ago, a young investor had walked into the foundation's office with a modest first donation and a single request that her name never be attached to anything the money touched. She said that woman had returned every single year since, her contributions growing steadily as her own fortunes grew, always with the same quiet condition attached. Tonight, Rebecca said, that woman had finally agreed to step into the light, not for recognition, but because the foundation believed her story could inspire others to give without needing applause for it. Then she read the name aloud, clear and unmistakable across the silent ballroom, Imani Brooks. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if some collective understanding rippled outward from the stage, 300 people rose to their feet at once, applause thundering through the room in a wave that seemed to physically press against the walls. Samuel Pierce made his way down from the side of the stage, cutting through the crowd with quick, purposeful steps until he reached Imani's side, his hand extended in a mixture of pride and relief. Victoria followed close behind, wrapping her arms around Imani in an embrace that spoke of years of shared secrecy, finally allowed to breathe. Imani stood still for a moment, absorbing the sound, her expression calm even as something behind her eyes shifted, something like release. She had spent 12 years building this exact outcome from the shadows, funding it quietly, watching its impact unfold from a careful distance, and now, standing in the center of it, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what she had built. Beside her, Ethan had gone completely still, his face draining of color as the applause roared around him. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the polished floor, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the noise of the crowd. He stared at his wife, as though seeing her for the first time, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the woman he had lectured about her dress an hour earlier, with the name that had just been announced to a room full of the most powerful people in the city. Andrew Sloane, standing a few feet away, looked between Ethan and Imani with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and second-hand humiliation. The woman in the emerald gown who had laughed at Imani's answer earlier now stood frozen, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, her face flushed with the specific horror of someone realizing they had insulted precisely the wrong person. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some of admiration, some of pure astonishment, as people began putting together the pieces of what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. Nobody in that ballroom, save for a handful of people, had understood what they were looking at just moments earlier. The quiet woman who had been standing behind her husband all evening, following his instructions, absorbing his criticisms without complaint, was the same woman who had built hospitals and funded futures for children she would never meet. The realization moved through the crowd like a current, and somewhere within that current, Ethan Whitmore stood utterly exposed, the man who had spent the entire evening worrying about his own reputation now watching it crumble beneath the weight of what he hadn't known about the person standing beside him. As the applause finally began to settle, Victoria took the microphone briefly, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving through her. She told the room that Imani had insisted, every single year for 12 years, that her name remain hidden from every project she funded. No plaques, no press interviews, no public recognition of any kind, not even at the smaller donor events where such things were customary. She explained that the foundation had honored that wish out of deep respect, even as it grew increasingly difficult to explain to journalists why their largest donor refused every request for an interview. She spoke about the Children's Hospital wing, describing how Imani had personally reviewed every architectural plan to ensure the space felt less clinical and more like a place where frightened children might actually feel safe. She spoke about the scholarship program, mentioning that Imani had insisted on funding students who came from backgrounds most selective programs overlooked entirely, students without perfect grades, but with resilience that couldn't be measured on a transcript. Around the room, guests who had spent years assuming they understood the shape of the city's philanthropic landscape now found themselves recalculating everything they thought they knew. A woman near the front, whose grandson had received treatment at the Pediatric Research Center years earlier, began quietly crying, her hand pressed against her chest as she looked toward Imani with an expression of pure gratitude. A university board member, Ethan, had spent all evening trying to impress, turned toward him with newfound interest, though not the kind Ethan had hoped for, curiosity mixed with something closer to disbelief, that this man had been married to Imani Brooks the entire time without anyone, including apparently himself, having any idea. Samuel Pierce spoke next, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. He told the room that thousands of lives had been changed because one woman had decided, over a decade ago, that doing good mattered more than being seen doing it. He said that in his 30 years running charitable organizations, he had never encountered a donor so consistently, deliberately invisible, and that her example had quietly reshaped how the foundation itself thought about the purpose behind giving. Ethan stood frozen through all of it, his earlier confidence completely dissolved, replaced by the slow, sinking understanding that he had spent years married to a woman whose true nature had been entirely hidden from him, not because she was dishonest, but because he had never once created the kind of space where such a truth could safely exist. He had spent the evening worrying about how his wife's dress reflected on him, never once considering that the woman wearing it had quietly reshaped an entire city's charitable infrastructure without needing his approval or his attention to do it. In the hours following the announcement, the ballroom transformed into something closer to a press conference than a gala. Journalists who had spent the evening chasing quotes from senators and hospital executives now clustered around Imani, notebooks and recorders extended, questions overlapping each other in their eagerness to understand how she had managed to keep such an enormous secret for so long. Business owners, who had never previously acknowledged Ethan, beyond a polite handshake, now approached Imani directly, extending business cards and requesting meetings, eager to align themselves with a woman whose judgment had apparently been shaping the city's most successful charitable ventures for over a decade. Ethan tried, more than once, to push through the crowd surrounding his wife, his expression shifting between panic and desperation, as he attempted to reclaim some version of the narrative he had lost control of the moment. Rebecca Collins read that name aloud. He caught her attention briefly near the edge of the crowd, his voice low and urgent as he tried to apologize, tried to explain that he hadn't known, as though not knowing somehow excused the way he had treated her. Imani looked at him for a long moment before responding, her expression calm but unmistakably resolute, the same stillness she had carried all evening, now carrying an entirely different weight. She told him, quietly enough that only he could hear, that he had never actually been embarrassed by her. She said what he'd really been embarrassed by was the fear that she wasn't valuable enough to elevate his own status in front of people whose opinions he cared more about than hers. The words landed with a precision that left Ethan completely silent, his mouth opening slightly as though searching for a rebuttal that simply didn't exist. Around them, the party continued, the noise and energy of the evening swirling past the two of them, as though they existed in a separate, quieter world, where the truth of their marriage had finally, unavoidably, surfaced. Andrew Sloane, watching from a short distance away, said nothing at all, his earlier laughter now replaced by the uncomfortable silence of a man realizing he'd been complicit in something he hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. Later that night, once the crowd had thinned and the catering staff had begun clearing the last of the champagne glasses from the tables, Ethan tried once more, this time away from the noise, away from any audience that might witness his humiliation a second time. He found Imani near the coat check, quietly thanking Samuel Pierce for the years of discretion the foundation had shown her, and he waited until she was alone before approaching again. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost the polished confidence it carried earlier in the evening. He asked her, quietly, how long she had been planning to keep it from him, as though the secrecy itself were the injury rather than everything that had led to it. Imani studied him for a long moment before answering. She told him she hadn't been keeping it from him so much as protecting it, and that somewhere along the way he had made it clear, through 1,000 small comments over 9 years, that her ambitions, her achievements, and even her quiet successes were only worth celebrating if they made him look good in the process. She told him that a marriage built on that kind of arithmetic was never going to survive contact with the truth, and that tonight had simply been the moment the math finally became impossible to hide. News of the gala spread quickly through the following days, first through the papers that had covered the event, then through wider business circles that had somehow always assumed anonymous philanthropy belonged to old money families rather than a woman who had built her fortune quietly and methodically over the course of 2 decades. Imani found herself fielding requests from foundations across the country, organizations eager to learn from her approach, universities hoping she might consider expanding her scholarship program beyond the city where it had started. She handled the attention the way she handled most things, with careful deliberation rather than excitement, choosing which opportunities aligned with the values she had spent 12 years quietly building her work around. She turned down most interview requests, though she agreed to a handful of conversations with journalists whose questions actually seemed to matter, whose interests lay in the work itself, rather than the novelty of a woman who had hidden her wealth from the people closest to her. One reporter, a woman named Diane Marsh, who had covered the city's business community for nearly 20 years, asked Imani directly why she had chosen that particular gala, of all the events over the years, to finally reveal herself. Imani thought about the question for a long moment before answering honestly. She said that for over a decade, hiding had felt like protection, a way of ensuring that her generosity was never mistaken for performance and that the people she helped were never overshadowed by her own story. But somewhere in the last year, she had begun to notice how many young women who reminded her of herself 20 years earlier, seemed to believe that quiet competence would eventually be noticed and rewarded on its own, without ever needing to be claimed out loud. She said she wanted, at least once, to prove that a woman could build something enormous without asking permission from anyone, and then choose, entirely on her own terms, exactly when and how the world would learn her name. Business owners who approached her in the weeks following the gala found a woman who listened far more than she spoke, weighing every proposal with the same careful patience she had once reserved for her own private ledgers. She declined most of the partnership offers that came her way, uninterested in ventures that seemed designed primarily to attach her name to someone else's ambition. The offers she did accept tended to share a common thread: small, community-rooted initiatives run by people who had clearly done meaningful work long before anyone with real money had ever noticed them. And Imani found a quiet satisfaction in being the kind of resource that made that work sustainable, rather than merely visible. At home, the space between Imani and Ethan grew quieter with each passing day, not through argument, but through a kind of mutual recognition that something fundamental had shifted and could not simply be talked back into place. Ethan tried, in his own way, to adjust, complimenting her more, asking questions about her work that he had never bothered to ask before, but the questions arrived too late to feel like anything other than damage control. Imani answered them politely, but something in her had already begun making a decision that had been quietly forming long before that gala, a decision that had simply needed the right moment to fully take shape. Weeks later, in a conversation that unfolded without raised voices or dramatic declarations, Imani told Ethan that she intended to move forward with her life differently, that the marriage had run its course long before the gala had exposed the truth of who she really was. She explained, with the same calm steadiness she brought to every difficult conversation, that she didn't hold anger toward him so much as clarity, a recognition that she had spent years shrinking herself to fit inside a relationship that had never made room for the full shape of who she actually was. Ethan listened, and for perhaps the first time in their marriage, he didn't argue back. He seemed to understand finally that the woman standing in front of him had never needed his approval to be extraordinary, and that his insistence on shaping her into something smaller had cost him something he hadn't fully appreciated until it was already gone. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, only the quiet, final acknowledgement of two people whose paths, it turned out, had been diverging for far longer than either of them had allowed themselves to admit. In the months that followed, Imani channeled the public attention into something she had never previously considered: the creation of a new initiative built not just to fund causes anonymously, but to speak openly about the value of generosity that expected nothing in return. She began accepting select speaking invitations, standing before rooms full of young entrepreneurs, students, and community leaders, sharing not the details of her wealth, but the philosophy that had guided her giving for over a decade. She spoke about the years she had spent being underestimated, dismissed by people who measured worth by appearance rather than substance, and how that experience had shaped her decision to give quietly rather than loudly, to let the work speak in ways that her presence never could. She told audiences that she wasn't stepping into the spotlight for recognition, but because she had come to believe that visibility, used carefully, could remind people that kindness still existed in a world that often seemed to reward everything except it. One afternoon, after a talk at a local university, a young woman approached her near the exit, waiting patiently until the small crowd around Imani had thinned before speaking. She said she had grown up watching her own mother shrink herself smaller and smaller inside a marriage that never made room for her ambitions, and she asked, almost hesitantly, how Imani had found the courage to finally let herself be fully seen. Imani considered the question carefully before answering, the way she considered most things that mattered. She told the young woman that courage hadn't come first. What came first was simply exhaustion, the slow accumulation of years spent making herself smaller for someone else's comfort, until one day the cost of staying hidden finally outweighed the fear of being seen. The young woman nodded slowly, something in her expression suggesting she understood far more of that answer than her age might have implied, and Imani found herself hoping, quietly, that the words might spare someone else a few of the years it had taken her to arrive at that same understanding. Victoria Langley and Samuel Pierce remained close collaborators in the years that followed, the foundation expanding under Imani's more visible, though still deliberately measured, involvement. New scholarship recipients were selected each year with the same care that had defined the program since its quiet beginning, and the hospital wing that had first appeared in that Gala video continued treating children whose families would likely never know the name behind the equipment, keeping their sons and daughters alive. Imani made a point of visiting occasionally, unannounced, choosing to walk the halls without press or fanfare, preferring the quiet company of nurses and patients to any headline her presence might generate. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of legacy she had always intended to build, one measured not in recognition, but in the lives it had quietly, steadily changed. At her final address of that year, standing before a packed auditorium of donors, students, and community organizers, Imani spoke without notes, her voice steady and unhurried the way it always was when she said something she truly meant. She told the room that generosity didn't need a spotlight to matter, but that sometimes a spotlight helped remind people that quiet kindness was still out there, still working, still changing lives in ways that rarely made headlines. The room rose to its feet, applause stretching on for what felt like several full minutes, warm and sustained in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with genuine respect. Near the back of the auditorium, unnoticed by most of the crowd, Ethan Whitmore quietly rose from his seat and slipped out through a side door, his expression unreadable, carrying with him the understanding that had arrived far too late to change anything between them. He understood, finally, standing alone in the hallway outside that auditorium, that status had never actually come from the cut of a suit, the names dropped in casual conversation, or the careful curation of who stood beside him in a crowded room. It came from something quieter, something he had spent his entire adult life overlooking in his pursuit of appearances, the kind of decency that didn't need an audience to be real. Imani, meanwhile, walked out of that auditorium into the evening air with a steadiness that had nothing performative about it, the applause still echoing faintly behind her as she stepped into the world she had quietly built for herself, brick by careful brick, over more years than most people would ever know. She carried no bitterness with her, only the calm certainty of a woman who had finally stopped shrinking to fit inside someone else's idea of who she should be, stepping instead into a life shaped entirely by the values she had protected in silence for so long, now finally, fully, her own.